So when I was younger and I was taking my first baby steps into the world of history, I always imagined myself visiting museums and old dusty archives, rustling through piles of ancient documents and squelching through fields with a metal detector. I was perhaps even young and naive enough to imagine that maybe one day I'll get a job working for an archive, or perhaps I'll oversee a collection in a museum, or maybe I'll dive headfirst so far down the history knowledge hole I shall ascend to that greatest of all historian positions, being a guest star on Channel 4's Time Team. I dreamed of the days I would host my own historical documentaries, write my own books, and give lectures in universities. I never would have imagined that I would spend most of my life from that point on, sitting with my face buried in my hands, while yet another tea-drinking, beardy man in a cardigan tells me the fascinating story of how the Russians strapped landmines to dogs, and how ironic it was that the dogs immediately turned round and blew up the Russian tanks. Oh, how I laughed the first 40-odd times! It didn't do too well for my character, I must admit. I became somewhat loathing of my friends every time they would mention to someone that I was into history, and I would look over with that mixture of fear, loathing, and pure hatred. And sure enough, there was that casual nod, and then that slow smile spread across that stupid face as they began their assault on my mental health. Well, did you know? And once again, I had to listen as they continued to drone on about their batshit theory that if the Germans had won, we'd have none of this woke shit. We'd have colonized Mars and have laser guns by now. You politely restrain yourself as they comment how the Allies had won just by sheer weight of numbers, and if only the Germans had built more Panther tanks, then you and I would be speaking German by now. Of course, I've always proclaimed one can never truly call yourself a historian unless you develop a serious eye twitch anytime one of these fuckers opens their mouth, and you become almost filled with this blind rage and the voices of 1,000 of your ancestors chant in unison, egging you on to jam a history book down the fucker's mouth, screaming your fiercest battle cry so that maybe, just maybe, he might actually learn something. Some say that is excessive in terms of force. I say you haven't lived until you've taken down at least one of these idiots at a wine tasting party with a hardback copy of Defeating the Panzerstücke Menace by David Lister. Other books are available. I did at one point start writing my own history book. Unfortunately, no publisher would ever take me seriously when I insisted that the entire thing be printed on fuzzy felt to appeal to the general audience. I'm ranting again and I don't apologize for it. Veraboos. You've seen them. They're always sneaking around in web forums and discussion blogs, historical discussion tabs and discords, or the side chat of World War II games. Wherever history is being discussed, a wehraboo will be found, scuttling around under rocks and into the dark places. Amateur historians who have seen a few documentaries, read a few books, and think they've come to some pretty exciting conclusions. Actually, you know what? No, sir, I disagree. That is not a wehraboo. I don't care what you've been told. A man who thinks Nazi Germany was the greatest military force in the world is not a wehraboo. That's just a common idiot. The sheer magnitude of books and films and documentaries released over the past 60 years which have proclaimed this invincible Nazi empire as a fact has been overwhelming. The idea of the revolutionary, incredible, and oh so invincible Nazi war machine, stopped only by sheer numbers of inferior tanks, is what I'd expect any common idiot on the street to tell me. Let's call him John. No, sir. A wehraboo is typically someone who has not fallen in love with history. They care not for any crumb of historical knowledge outside of that one specialist subject of German Second World War stuff. And they write endless pages of comments justifying their belief in the Nazi war machine and how it laid the foundations of modern warfare. Dare I say we even use blitzkrieg as a battle tactic today, they might proclaim. Wehraboo might even tell you, if you could stand the stench on their breath, that they are not a Nazi. No, sir, they don't believe in the politics. They just think Nazi stuff was the best and looks the coolest. Essentially, they've fallen in love with the aesthetic. And the biggest part of that aesthetic is the idea of the refined officer class. Big offices, fabulously decorated homes, and an air of professionalism and pride, discussing war tactics over a glass of wine or a fine whiskey, dressed in the most immaculate of uniforms, conducting themselves as refined gentlemen should. Now you and I, we both know This is all complete bullshit. These were not refined gentlemen. These were drug-addled psychopaths who had all the class and sophistication of a crack house, and who would fall into childish petty squabbles at the drop of a hat. The idea of the refined German officer was a myth created by Nazi propaganda and enhanced in the 50s to try and get the new member NATO states used to the idea of working with their former enemy Germany. Look at this refined, honourable gentleman who did his duty and fought fiercely, and if Germany have a few more of those, then the Russians don't stand a chance. And into this myth comes a wave of published memoirs documenting their side of the story, blaming Hitler for everything and proclaiming loudly that if they just had everything they needed, and more importantly had everyone else in this context being the dead ones, not spent their time squabbling over prestige tokens, then Germany would have won. But probably also because they were angling for jobs as advisors to NATO, who were probably very interested in speaking to anyone who had experience fighting the Russians. Now, Crown Prince of this has always been Mr. Heinz I Invented Everything Guderian, who wrote in his book, which has been revised numerous times by various people to include yet more great feats of military strategy, that he single-handedly invented the idea of combined arms warfare. Though I must also give credit to Rommel, who got a head start by writing his book mid-war, and then having everyone else publish a fairy tale version of it, translated into every language possible after his death, in which he talks about these dashing clashes of armor duels in the opening months of France and Africa, forgetting that he was so petty when he received an order he didn't agree with, or from someone he didn't like, he would switch off his radio set and ignore it, only turning it back on when he'd outrun his own supply lines and needed to beg for fuel, which he did consistently. Far from being the military genius, he was a one-trick pony that relied on British incompetence in the desert, which he routinely failed to take advantage of, driving his entire forces into pointless charges to cover as much ground as possible until they ran out of fuel and became easy prey for dug-in Allied defences. Once the Brits got their shit sorted out, Rommel lost every single battle. But of course, his memoirs would just blame that on the silly Italians. He was not to blame. He was a military genius. Oh yes, he was. But our story does not concern these boys. Our story centers on another one who thankfully did not get to write his own memoirs, though he did write his own legacy. He is one of the most talked about tank commanders in history. No one could even mention German World War II tanks without bringing him up, and even the History Channel made this wonderfully funny documentary where they proclaimed that if he were alive today, he would still be one of the greatest who ever lived. His story has spawned countless legends, books, stories, inspired films, and a generation of man-babies parading up and down their house in SS uniforms, pretending they are him. Yes, today we are talking about that bastard, Michael Wittmann. But first, who is Wittmann, and why is he so famous? Wittmann was a tank commander, often cited as a tank ace, the Black Baron or the ace among aces by post-war sensationalist news articles and books. He was the son of a farmer who rose quickly through the ranks, first as a guard in the Lebensstandard, and then for the LSSAH as a driver and then commander of an armoured car during the Polish campaign. His daring, patience and charming attitude made him quite favoured among his commanders. Also, he was Bavarian, which kind of does help. And he quickly found himself being retrained as the commander to a squad of Stug 3 assault guns. Wittmann would serve with honours, operating first in Yugoslavia and then in Greece before finally being shipped out to the Eastern Front, where his actions with the Stug destroyed a number of T-34s and earned him the Iron Cross Second Class. His reward for bravery was to command the Russian tankers who had survived their encounter with him be given the very best of medical care, thus earning him a reputation as a gentleman and a man of honour. His success would continue through 1942 and 1943. He would earn even more awards in this time: the Knight's Cross, the Iron Cross First Class, the Tank Assault Badge in silver, and the Wound Badge in black. Several promotions later, and he was finally selected for officer training. He promptly then won several more awards, including the Royal Bulgarian Soldier's Cross of the Order of Bravery Second Class in August, and later in the same month he was decorated with the Eastern Front Medal. But it would be here that Wittmann would be retrained, not as an assault gun commander, but as a tank commander. And the tank he would be given command of would be the mighty Panzer VI, the Tiger. He was also briefly in charge of a Panzer III, but so little of that time has been recorded and it's not really that interesting. He would take part in the famed Battle of Kursk and end his career on the Eastern Front having scored a near total of 90 kills, never having lost a tank under his command. He would be awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross and later the Oak Leaves to the Iron Cross upon receiving a personal telegram from Hitler himself. Now, if you haven't already guessed by the title of this video, a lot of what I've just told you might sound a little bit suspicious. In fact, it feels like I'm almost reading from fanfiction, which is good. It means your skeptical senses are working today. And boy, are you going to need them. Because now we get to the most famous battle of Wittmann's career, the Battle of Villers-Bocage. It's June 1944, D-Day has begun, and the combined arms of the United States, Canada and Britain, as well as the not-to-be-understated amount from France, Poland and India, have arrived in a 50-mile stretch of beach in Normandy, and the mighty German Reich, having spent the first half of the war laughing at France and its line of static defences, while proclaiming loudly that in this new age of mobile armoured warfare, static defences are useless, decided the best defence against these landings was a series of static defences. This goes about as well as expected. Though far from a cakewalk, the landings are successful. Allied forces establish a beachhead, and around 130,000 troops now push inland. In the British sector, the city of Caen, which was originally penned as a day one objective, is proving a somewhat difficult nut to crack. Caen has vital airfields as well as rail and road links. Taking it is a priority, as if the Germans can hold it, they can more easily reinforce units which are currently fighting in the American sector. Now, the Brits and Canadians have a tough time with this because, as every British historian with an axe to grind after suffering from years of it being forgotten that Britain even did anything during World War II will happily point out, the vast majority of Germany's elite troops and panzer divisions were pointed at them. Not that the Americans were having a particularly easy time regardless. They had Patton leading them, which, at this point should have really just been considered an act of sabotage. Now, in order to try and surround the besieged city of Caen, the Brits attempt a flanking maneuver, which will take them through the town of Villers-Bocage, and it's here they come face to face with the one and only Michael Wittmann. Once upon a time there lived a little tank company, and as the sun beat down upon this company it glazed the silken dark Bavarian skin of the true man, one Michael Wittmann. He flexed his perfectly toned muscles and laughed his beautiful laugh. Ha 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 ha! His hair flowing majestically in the wind. Gosh, you're so cool, said the other tankers, and pinned yet another medal to his bare chest. But he just laughed off the pain because he was cool like that. But alas, the evil British Empire and their backwards monarchy society had come to ruin the day. We're going to bomb the old folks' home in Dresden, they said with their twisted evil smiles. But Wittmann would not allow such a thing, so he leapt from his chair and single-handedly destroyed 20 tanks before flying back across the border to safety. And the angels did cheer. No, wait, that's what the wehraboo's think happened. Okay, essentially, if you're not aware, Michael Wittmann is the commander of a Tiger tank, and during one of the many battles in France that took place after D-Day, he allegedly fought the vanguard of the British 7th Armoured Brigade, the famed Desert Rats, single-handed, destroying over 20 tanks completely by himself in a village called Villers-Bocage. Now, as you may have guessed from the tone of this video, that's not actually what happened. What actually happened is going to be a little bit confusing, at least at first. Now you see, we do have a lot of sources about this battle. The British would publish 2 reports in it, the Germans 3. Wittmann was even interviewed for radio, and some of the British tankers involved were interviewed by the British newspapers, who compiled it all together into a story. The problem is, all of these sources greatly disagree with each other over what happened. Now, if you're a typical historian who's used to working with primary sources, that will not be of any great shock to you. This happens a lot in history. It's why I laugh at people when they tell me that being a historian is all about shuffling through dusty old archives and looking at primary sources. It's not. That's about a third of it. But a huge problem with a lot, not all, but a lot of historians is they tend to get born into academia. They get used to the library and the classroom and think that's all there is, or think that's the single most important part. It's not. There's actually this thing called the historian's triangle of academia, practical, and reenactment. Once you've done all 3, then you've probably got a better understanding of what went down. But as you might expect, a lot of people in academia don't really value reenactors so much. And a lot of reenactors get really pissed off at snotty academics telling them that they're wrong. It's why I've always said if you want to be a historian, don't study history, study people. History will teach you dates and events, and if you're on a really good course, how to look up things in an archive and label your sources correctly. Studying people will give you a better perspective on how the human mind works and how people think, and that's important because academia often makes the mistake that a primary source overwrites everything else, and doesn't handle particularly well the idea that it was a human who wrote that primary source. Humans who notoriously get things wrong, who lie, who exaggerate, or think they saw something when they didn't, or remember something very clearly that didn't happen. But you try telling a professor that the sources he cites might be wrong because they were written by humans, and watch him swell up like a balloon. In our case, every single report on the Battle of Villers-Bocage is wrong. Wittmann's original report was edited by Nazi propagandists to put Wittmann center stage and make him sound a lot more heroic. The radio interview was by Signal, a Nazi propaganda magazine whose sole purpose was to make everything Nazi Germany sound amazing and brilliant. It's available online and is often used by a source by idiots who have yet to realise that Nazi Germany lied. Quite a lot. Mobius, Wittmann's second, lied because he wanted to make himself sound more heroic, and he was tired of constantly playing second fiddle to Wittmann. The Panzerlehr lied because they weren't there. They arrived much later, and Kurt Meyer, who was its commander at the time, famously hated Wittmann. But he would go on to survive the war, and become one of the most prolific Nazi apologists of the 1950s, who would write books and give grand speeches in which he debunked what he claimed were the myths of Nazi war crimes, and greatly over-exaggerated the might and power of the SS as a fighting unit. He now resides in his grave with a tombstone clearly inspired by Flash Gordon. The British, on the other hand, well, the British are notoriously bad at writing reports. They hate doing it, and they typically want to get it over and done with as quickly as possible. None of the commanders who wrote reports actually witnessed the event, and British newspapers are not exactly known for their reliability and hard-hitting journalism, especially during the 1940s. Especially when you realise the newspaper who wrote the report was the Daily Mail. The other problem, of course, is if you go into this, you will be balls deep in about 500 other historians, all milling around doing essentially nothing, all trying to be new and exciting without actually doing anything helpful. I'll give you an example. The YouTube channel World War II TV, now this is a fairly decent channel, I do like it, did a video with Daniel Taylor back in 2020. Now Taylor is the curator of the Kent and Sharpshooters Museum. Sharpshooters in the Queen's Own were the groups present at Villers-Bocage. So out of everyone, I believe this man has the most knowledge on the subject matter, and it would have been brilliant to actually hear what he had to say on it. The video by World War II TV, however, is a bit of a fever dream. They're doing it on the anniversary of the battle, and rather than just produce a video, they instead opt for a live stream, where in the middle of COVID, they have a bunch of people roaming around Villers-Bocage with cameras. They seem to believe that this would be some sort of epic, never-done-before spectacle, but in reality they spend much of their time talking into dead air while they wait for a cameraman to get into position. They interrupt Taylor several times mid-story because one of their cameramen is now finally standing on the road where all this happened, and then you get this grainy image of a road in France because their bandwidth is terrible and they're trying to do it over Zoom. They are plagued with technical issues. They even have the slideshow of images that isn't well prepared, and Taylor half the time just ends up holding a picture up to the camera. There's a reason this channel only has 46,000 subscribers. There is a wealth of good information here, but it is presented so jarringly, it is a difficult video to watch. It would have been far better had they just let Taylor speak and had little tokens moving around a map with references to the photos and where they were taken, and maybe some overviews on Google Maps to give a clearer picture of where everything was, rather than watching a guy get stuck in traffic for 20 minutes while he drives to the road, the actual road where the battle took place. Now, the actual road is no longer there, but as you can see where the hedgerows would have been if they were still there, it just didn't work. Taylor is a very knowledgeable person. It would have been far better had everyone else just shut up and let him speak for an hour. But they had to advertise this as a fresh, new, exciting, never-done-before experience, and this is the main problem with the Battle of Villers-Bocage. This is, quite potentially, the most overstudied battle in history. And the problem is not a lack of information, but the sheer overwhelming amount of it. And most of it, which is contradictory or biased in nature, takes too much from one source, or takes Nazi propaganda as verbatim, or just repeats the same bullshit over and over and over. Now, the absolute worst I could do here is wade asshole first into the shitstorm, make up yet more shit, and then proclaim that my shit is better because it has come out of my ass. So I'm not going to. Instead, I'm just going to assume that Taylor's version of the timeline is correct and go through it, dispelling any myths along the way. Now, I know many of you will have heard a different version of this battle that you absolutely 100% know is the right version and may think I have gotten everything wrong, and how dare I? I'm going to write a comment that'll show the pig. But frankly, Taylor has done more research than I have on this subject, and more importantly, done more research than you have. So if you think I'm wrong, I'll be sure to pass your comments along. Firstly, I think it's important to understand why the British were at Villers-Bocage, and why they seem so complacent. They're sitting down to tea, they're not really prepared to fight anything, they're just doing maintenance. And the reason why they're doing this is kind of glossed over. It's typically put down as British stupidity that they would be halfway through a major assault and then stop to have tea. Which did happen. I'll be the first to admit that. The common British soldier was heavily unionised, so they demanded regular tea breaks. There's this famous story in Italy where a bunch of American paratroopers get lost in the dark and find a squad of Brits probing the front lines, so they link up with them and the Brits pause to have a tea break, much to the disbelief of the Americans. But this wasn't that. What was actually happening was panic. On the German side, a series of very aggressive and very successful assaults across the American line had opened up a hole in the German defences directly between the British and American sectors. Sensing they had very little time to act, the Brits then pushed into this gap. Their objective is a big hill called Point 213. If the Brits can control this, they can easily see the movements of anyone surrounding Caen, and more importantly, direct artillery onto anyone surrounding Caen. Now, to get to that point, the Brits will have to push through this village, Villers-Bocage. Now, when they get there, French civilians are celebrating. There had been a German command post and a field hospital there, but those had been abandoned. The few German soldiers left surrendered without a fight. The French were adamant the Germans had fully retreated from the area and that German tanks were in a different town several miles away. Now, it would be wrong to think that the Brits had not been doing their own recon. A lot of British commanders at the time were worried that not enough reconnaissance was being done, so this kind of gets picked up on quite a lot. But they actually were. The problem was twofold. Firstly, it was the speed of the advance. It had to be fast. The Brits were hoping their advance would go undetected, but sporadic sniper fire, a Panzerschreck ambush which lost them a Sherman, and a few encounters with armoured cars proved that the Germans indeed knew exactly where they were, and could probably guess where they were going. So they had to, in the words of one famous blue hedgehog, go fast. The second problem was that they were in fact doing their own recon. They had flooded the surrounding countryside with armoured cars. But we're talking this is 1940s French countryside. And a lot of people I don't think truly understand the power of a French hedge. This is a British hedge. It's basic, it's leafy, it keeps your neighbours out of your yard, and you use it to stash Pormacs and beer because your mum won't let you have those in the house. This is a French bocage hedge. Getting anything through those, especially if it's got wheels, is almost impossible, so the armoured cars have to follow the roads, and all roads lead to Caen. Specifically, lead to where the Germans are trying to push into the city. There are very few roads leading south, so the Brits basically have to go in blind, following the one route they can. Now, when Wittmann begins his attack charging down this road, you'd be forgiven for thinking that he was attacking the main British advance, which had stopped for tea, because that's usually how the story starts. The dumb British sitting down for tea. Ha ha ha. It was not the main British advance. The main advance, a group of Shermans from the sharpshooters, had already advanced towards the hill and secured it. Wittmann had remained hidden as he watched them go by. Contrary to what many claim, he was not up a hill observing the British, he was in a dry riverbed, completely unaware that anything was going on, until certain officers and medical staff that were fleeing Villers-Bocage made him aware. Now, of course, Wittmann wasn't alone. He had several other Tigers under his command, and there is this big debate about which tank he was actually in. I'm going to gloss over this because I want to get back to it later. Wittmann begins his attack. He opens fire on the Sherman at the back of the column, which had the unfortunate name of Pistol Packin' Mama. That's not a Fallout reference, by the way, the tank was actually called that.
Pistol Packin' Mama, lay that pistol down.
Wittmann then bursts through this hedge and starts machine gunning down the convoy. The tank at the head of the column, a Firefly, finds this somewhat disagreeable and manages to rotate its turret and get a shot off at Wittmann. I'll return to that bit later. Thankfully for Wittmann, Sobert is still hanging around at a different Tiger and manages to take it out. The only other vehicles here are soft skin vehicles, largely half-tracks, the American-made M3, one of which is the medical half-track, which Wittmann fills full of holes. This is what one of those would have looked like. The hood is painted bright white with a red cross in it that Wittmann would have been able to see from his elevated position. I'm making a point here and I'll get back to it later. Wittmann continues down this road, leaving Sobert behind, where he encounters 4 Cromwell tanks. Now, I don't care how good his crew claimed they were. It took the best Tiger crews about 6 seconds to reload each shell. 4 Cromwells firing back at him would have eviscerated Wittmann. But this is where I present a new argument. Wittmann is not the greatest tank commander who ever lived. He is the luckiest one. Out of all the Cromwells on that road, only 1 was actually capable of firing at him. 2 were OP Cromwells, having extra radio sets and built for artillery observation. 1 was unmanned. The only one capable of actually firing at Wittmann did not have his gunner on board. So when he saw this Tiger charging down the road towards him, he took the most obvious course of action and reversed into a garden. Wittmann would fail to spot him. This is Captain Pat Dias. He is going to become very important in just a little bit. Wittmann's luck is going to continue as he enters the town. He comes across a Sherman. Lucky for him, it's an OP Sherman with a dummy gun, and the only crew member on board is the driver. Wittmann misses the first shot, and the second goes through the turret and splits the dummy gun in half. The driver bails and claims he was shot at with MG fire. Wittmann drives on and comes across a second tank. This is the Cromwell of Paddy Victory, a man who would survive this encounter and go on to write about it. By striking luck, Paddy had been attempting to back his Cromwell up and had gotten it wedged onto a curbstone. It stretched out sideways across the street and can't move. He notices the Tiger bearing down on him and decides to bail. Again, Wittmann scores a kill without any return fire. Wittmann carries on and comes across another tank, another Firefly. Wittmann takes aim at the Firefly and misses. The Firefly does not. But in a startling moment of yet more good luck, Wittmann orders the tank to reverse, and the Tiger lurches backwards at the exact same time the Firefly opens fire. The shot places a gash down the side of the Tiger's turret. This will be important later. Wittmann then reversed into a house, the rubble blocks the path of the Firefly, throws dust and smoke into the air, and he's able to turn around and drive back the way he came. At this point, he comes across another Cromwell. This is the one commanded by Dias, the one that reversed into the garden earlier. He's chased Wittmann into the town, and the two have now come face to face. And now finally, for the first time in this battle, an actual armoured duel is about to take place. And what transpires is pretty much what is written down. The Cromwell fires twice, cannot penetrate the Tiger's armour, the Tiger fires back, and Dias in his report describes the feeling of an 88mm shell passing between his legs. The crew bails. But there is something very wrong here. While every documentary and book that covers this duel will focus on Dias' frustration that his gun cannot penetrate the mighty armour of the Tiger, in reality, it actually can. The Brits have been fighting Tigers since 1943 over longer ranges with smaller guns. Of the 29 Tigers that were sent to North Africa, none of them would return. The 75mm gun on the Cromwell is marginally more powerful than the one on the Sherman. At a range of roughly 100 meters, a shot from the Cromwell would split the Tiger in half. So why doesn't it? If you take away anything from a Laserpig video when I start bitching about tanks, then it should be that penetration tables you find on the internet are not worth the pixels they take up on your screen. Rough guides maybe, but as everyone should know by now, there are about 1,000 factors which can affect penetration. The quality of the steel, the angle of attack, the temperature, even the weather. So class, can anyone tell me what factor has affected this poor Cromwell? No one? Well, children, creepy Uncle Laserpig shall tell you. Originally, I thought it might have been the range, and I had this whole rant planned out at this point where I thought if the tanks were maybe too close, there was a chance, just a chance, that the Tiger might have been inside the Cromwell's minimum range, and that the round was still too hot when it smacked against the Tiger's armour, which might have just been enough to blunt the penetrating tip, causing it to deflect rather than pen. But given where Dice's Cromwell was found, and where Wittmann's Tiger was positioned when it was finally taken down, they are at least 300 meters apart, well outside the Cromwell's minimum range. And that last bit, that's actually quite significant. Where Dice's Cromwell was found doesn't make any sense. In an interview he gave in the 1980s, Dice claimed he stalked Wittmann for about 5 minutes, hoping to get a chance at firing at the Tiger's rear. But the Cromwell is a fast tank. In fact, it's one of the fastest tanks in the Normandy theatre. For Dice to be in the position he was in when he got taken out, to give Wittmann the time to engage a Sherman, a Cromwell, drive into the centre of town, duel with the Firefly, turn around and start heading back out, Dice would have had to be driving at a pace slower than walking. Now here you understand what that rant about primary sources was all about earlier on, because Dice is a primary source, and Dice is wrong. John Cloudsley Thompson, the famous naturalist, was one of the other Cromwell commanders that day. He and his crew were fortunate enough to escape, but in 1956 he would admit that he witnessed Dice speed out of the garden that he was in and chase after Wittmann almost immediately after he passed him. Assuming Wittmann always fired on the move, Dice would have been able to catch up with Wittmann as he drove past Paddy Victory. Paddy Victory had ordered his driver to hard reverse into a shop window while the crew jumped out. Wittmann didn't notice this Cromwell until he was driving past it, at which point, according to Captain Victory, he paused, turned the turret, and fired at the Cromwell, hitting it just below the turret. Paddy then jumped back into the Cromwell and attempted to fire the gun into the rear of the Tiger, but he couldn't move the turret. So instead, he smashed up the tank's equipment best he could before leaving, just in case it was captured. While he was doing this, he didn't notice Dice drive straight past him, attempting to sneak up behind Wittmann, but Wittmann's turret was already pointed to his rear, and had the perfect shot on Dice as he rounded the corner. Dice didn't get a single shot off. Whether he is mistaken, misremembering, was encouraged by a documentary and sensationalist history book publisher to be a little bit, economical with the truth, or, rah forbid, straight up lying, I don't know. But his account has been retold by almost every single historian who has covered this event without question, including Taylor. Because in academia, questioning the account of a World War II veteran is akin to questioning the existence of God to a Christian. Nothing, of course, detracts from Dice's bravery in the situation. Had Wittmann noticed Paddy Victory's tank a little earlier, his turret would be facing the other way, and Dice would have ended him right there and then. But again, Wittmann is not the greatest tank commander, he is the luckiest. So Wittmann carries on. He gets to the outskirts of the town, and when passing a grocery store, he is hit in the side with a 6-pounder anti-tank gun. The tank is disabled, and he is forced to bail. He bails, and bravely runs away. Bravely ran away. The gun was actually part of the convoy he supposedly destroyed en route into town. The troops had abandoned their vehicles as Wittmann tried to machine gun them down, got themselves organised, equipped with anti-tank weapons, and had flooded into the village. The 6-pounder in the doorway was not a sudden stroke of luck for the Brits, it was a well-prepared ambush. Wittmann then fires off a load of machine gun rounds, and the Brits decide to keep their heads down, allowing him to escape. This is, of course, the common interpretation of events, and as you might expect, it's complete bullshit. The Firefly I mentioned earlier was commanded by Sergeant Stan Lockwood. The common interpretation is that the Firefly was positioned here when Wittmann spotted it. It was not. Lockwood was actually here, and according to him, Wittmann was all the way over here, pretty much 5 or 6 yards from where he shot Victory and Dice. He was not, contrary to what you might have heard, taken out by a 6-pounder gun hiding in a doorway. He never made it that far into the village. This image that is famously attributed to being Wittmann's Tiger is not. Lockwood's gunner sights had been configured incorrectly, and as a result, his shot hit the building next to Wittmann, which created a lot of smoke and debris. Wittmann turned around and bravely drove away.
Bravely ran away.
He was later taken out here at Tilly Junction by the 6-pounder gun that was positioned on the road just up ahead. Now this may be in contrast to what you probably have heard, because the getting taken out by a 6-pounder gun hiding the doorway in the centre of town is what Wittmann claimed happened in his radio broadcast. His Nazi propaganda radio broadcast. But because the British commanders did not initially know what was going on, they took this broadcast as factual. In fact, they took it so matter-of-factly, they didn't even bother to check if it was true or not. Out of all the officers that would survive Villers-Bocage, including the one who would escape Point 213, none were ever debriefed. Their knowledge and experiences never made it into the reports, so the British ended up simply parroting Nazi propaganda. Now, part of the reason all this went unnoticed was because it allowed one General Dempsey to use the failure at Villers-Bocage to politically undermine his rivals, leading to the oh-so-famous, almost public scandal about the inferiority of British tanks in the eyes of the public that every documentary will suddenly cut to at this point, which in turn led to the great problem of tiger panic among the troops. Go Britain. But even now, decades later, this trend continues. While writing his book, Villers-Bocage Through the Lens, Taylor got the opportunity to speak with many of the veterans on the British side who were actually there, many of whom were so eager to speak on their experiences because no one had ever bothered to ask them about it. This should honestly give you an indication of the piss-poor level of research that many, in inverted commas, historians have actually done. If it had not been for Taylor, many of these men would have gone to their graves never having told their side of the story. Pat Dias, who was interviewed in the 80s, and then parts of that interview were broadcast on the Discovery Channel documentary Killer Tanks in 2004, remains the only person on the Allied side who was ever interviewed on camera. Dias would maintain that Wittmann had turned around by the time they came face to face, which cannot be true unless Dias sat around for several minutes doing nothing. Likely what happened was that, so many Tiger tank commanders, in order to compensate for their turret's slow traverse and get the gun onto targets faster, would order the entire tank to turn with the turret. So when Wittmann drove past Victory's Cromwell, he would have turned the entire tank, not just the turret, to get the gun on target faster. So when Dias came speeding around that corner, he would have seen Wittmann's Tiger now facing him, giving him the impression the Tiger had turned around and was now coming back the opposite way. But even if he is mistaken about the order in which events took place, that can hardly be his fault. He was being asked to talk about something that from his perspective happened over 40 years ago. He was an old man, he'd lived an entire life since then, and most likely he had forgotten a lot of the details. But what he did remember was that feeling of bitterness and inferiority that spread among the Allied forces thanks to the Nazi propaganda machine, the scandals and the sense that German tank designs were generations ahead of their own, which helped fuel the myths of the super advanced German war machines that have only recently started to finally be questioned. For many, Dias' shaky memory and Wittmann's radio broadcast, as well as the small amount of photographs that have made their way online, are the only sources people consult when writing their works on Villers-Bocage, which has allowed Wittmann to achieve an undeserved legendary status and an incorrect timeline to circulate throughout the common press, a timeline which people continue to argue about to this day. There are now so many different versions of this timeline that it is now starting to rival Marvel. And even with all the work done by Taylor, which still goes largely ignored, people continue to argue about the Battle of Villers-Bocage to this day. How many tanks did the British lose? How many tanks were actually there? Which tank was Wittmann in? Is the Hewitt Godfrey a clothing store or a grocer? And that's my problem with this. This is all semantics. People have gotten so caught up in the finer details of the battle that the actual outcome of the battle is ignored. The outcome that Michael Wittmann, the famous hero of the Reich and argued as the greatest tank commander who ever lived, is the first recorded loss of a Tiger tank on the Western Front in a battle the Germans didn't even technically win. And the real fun stuff, what happened when Wittmann got out of the tank, is often forgotten. And that's where we pick things up. Now Wittmann is out of the tank. Where does he go? What does he do? He is the commander of the 101st. There are 5 Tigers and a Panzer IV sitting around not doing anything, but he has no radio to contact him. He could return to his group and order them to attack, but instead he doesn't. Instead, Wittmann decides to walk back to the HQ of Panzerlehr, on foot. That's a journey that will take him an hour and a half. And while he's doing this, Panzerlehr start pushing towards Villers-Bocage, as do the 101st, now under the command of Mobius, as do the 2nd Panzer Army, which has been ordered to plug the gap. Because Wittmann has gone off alone, because he no longer has a radio, because he has not returned to his unit, absolutely no one on the German line knows what has just happened. As much as there is panic and confusion among the Brits, there is equal confusion among the Germans. They start to arrive piecemeal in Villers-Bocage and find the Brits there all now alert and prepared to fight tanks. The result was that when Wittmann's company, under the command of Mobius, arrived into the village, all 5 Tigers and 3 supporting Panzer IVs were destroyed. When the 2nd Panzer show up, though the Brits were falling back, they were still well prepared. 2nd Panzer, equipped with Panthers, suffered extremely heavy losses. By the following day, Panzerlehr were ready to attack. By this point, the Brits had fully organised themselves into a defensive box. Lehr would attack them piecemeal, firstly almost getting wiped out by American artillery, and then finally getting pushed back by a British counterattack. When Wittmann returned to Villers-Bocage several days later to reclaim his tank, he did so completely uncontested. Each Tiger tank had been burned out. The British had covered them with petrol-soaked blankets and set them on fire. They were unrecoverable. He then made a speech about how brilliant he was and got interviewed by a German propaganda magazine who altered a few facts, doctored a few photographs, and attributed all British losses that day to him. As most of you should know by now, Michael Wittmann is not Germany's highest scoring tank ace. That title belongs to Kurt Knispel, with 168 kills to his name, including one of the longest range tank-on-tank kills of the war at 3,000 metres. Knispel also drove a Tiger, and would become distinguished in his service on the Eastern Front, taking part in some of the most gruelling and largest tank battles in history, and eventually distinguished himself enough to be given command of a King Tiger. You'd expect a man of equal, if not greater distinction, to have been honoured in a similar way, but Knispel only ever received one award: the Gold Cross. In spite of appearing in some of the same battles as Wittmann, he was never awarded in the same way. There are no great tales of his battles, no blow-by-blow accounts featured in books and documentaries. His Wikipedia article is barely a few paragraphs long. Now, why is this? The answer is because Wittmann was a Nazi. Now, I don't mean that as a slur. I mean he was actually a Nazi. He joined the Nazi Party in the 1930s. He was a member of the SS, the military arm of the party. He was also slim, good-looking, wore his hair back, and had a charming yet confidently dominating personality. Knispel was not. He refused to shave, his hair was messy, he was apparently a bit of a practical joker, his uniform was often untidy, and he was highly critical of the Nazi Party and how it operated. At one point, attacking an officer he saw mistreating prisoners. He was also in the regular army, not the SS. In short, Wittmann was the very model of a perfect Nazi, and while not a true Aryan with brown hair and green eyes, he was everything Goebbels and his propaganda ministry wanted. This image of the refined, honourable Bavarian gentleman whose skill and cunning alone was a product of the regime and something that was allowed to prosper under it, and whose loyalty to the regime was unquestioned, and who could be kept happy with symbols and tokens of prestige. This is why he was decorated so much. This is why whenever he saw a new tank he wanted, he got it. This is why when his friends and colleagues were freezing in the great winters in Russia, he was in a Bavarian spa receiving officer training. He was provided all the best equipment, all the best training, a smart-looking black uniform, and if he didn't look quite heroic enough in his photograph, it was retaken so he would be. And when he returned to Germany, he would tour factories for the cameras, meeting the workers, delivering speeches about how important their work was to the war effort, all while covering up the damage done by Allied bombings. He was even featured in a film about how the King Tiger would bring victory that was shown to the German public. That should tell you more about the man he was and the people who worship him and his legend, because he wasn't innocent. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew those factories were barely operational. He could see the damage, and yet he had to lie to the cameras and claim that there was none. He could see the teams of slaves being forced to applaud him at gunpoint. He could see the Gestapo officers pretending to be factory managers, shaking his hand to pretend all was well, and he went along with it. He was not, as PanzerAce.net and many others have claimed, guilty of doing nothing but his duty, because he could have refused like Knispel had. But that would have meant giving up his station. That would mean giving up his medals and his comfortable life, his comfortable apartment, his meetings with Hitler, and his face on all the newspapers and propaganda rags. He was a Nazi. He was an integral part of the propaganda machine, and he loved it. He accepted it, and he enjoyed the privileged trappings that it brought him. The same could not be said for Knispel, Autocarius, or the 60 other German tankers who could also be attributed with the title of Panzer Ace, because outside of Wittmann, that term was never used. The term Panzer Ace, or Tank Ace, was never actually used by the Nazis, and awards or merits were never handed out based on individual kills, nor were individual kills ever really recorded in that way. Everything was recorded as a unit. The unit killed X number of tanks, not the individual, even if the unit only had one tank. This is why it has been so hard to determine if or not people like Dispelling and Carius actually achieved the kills attributed to them, but it has now become a very well established fact that the regular German here typically outperformed the SS. This was somewhat embarrassing, as the Germans, or more the Nazi propaganda machine, took every opportunity to promote the idea that the SS were superior. The SS was supposed to represent the very elite of the German fighting machine. The idea that the regular German army outperformed them was in contrast to this, so it became common to artificially create ace heroes by attributing the kills of the entire squad to one individual, or inflating kill scores by counting armoured cars and trucks and anti-tank guns as armoured kills. As the perfect icon of the proud, stern, brave and honourable gentleman tank commander, Wittmann was undoubtedly offered this privilege. We don't actually know what his kill count was. We probably never will with any reasonable degree of accuracy. But even if we did give him the benefit of the doubt and say that his unit made all those kills on the Eastern Front, then that doesn't exactly make him unique. You see, the T-34 kinda sucked. It was rushed to the front with very little training or preparation offered to the crews. In fact, during the first few months, many T-34s lacked an armor-piercing shell. The tank was awkward, slow, and was famously extremely difficult to see out of. The very early models were plagued with technical issues. Wittmann was in a Tiger, which in spite of that tank's overall failings, it did enjoy a superiority in range, firepower, and protection. Statistically, a Tiger commander could expect to obtain at least 30 to 40 kills before being killed themselves. Even the very worst or the very unlucky Tiger commander would typically expect to achieve an average of 7 kills. On the Eastern Front, Wittmann had 12 Tigers under his command, and with all of them attributing their kills to him, Wittmann was not some heroic legend, he was actually about average. If Villers-Bocage had not happened, it is doubtful anyone would know or care who Wittmann actually was, certainly not to the same degree we see him today. Because in reality, had Wittmann not attacked the British, the main vanguard would have arrived at a location they thought was safe, at the same time as Panzer as well as the 2nd Panzer arriving from the south came to back up Wittmann. They would have had fresh recon, which the British did not, and their counterattack would have had the element of surprise and potentially been devastating, trapping not just a small detachment, not just the vanguard, but the entire 7th Army in a pocket with no room to maneuver. Instead, when they did arrive, the Brits were dug in and well prepared, and with 6 Tigers down, their attack was somewhat blunted. The British didn't lose 27 tanks from Wittmann's attack, they lost 27 tanks in total. From an assault of 6 Tigers to a full-scale counterattack, 27 tanks was their total loss, and most of those were on point 213, where the British had burned their own tanks after realizing they were cut off and surrounded, leading to one of the British commanders at the time making a famous speech that someone better find his boots, because if he had to burn his tank, he wasn't going to walk to Berlin barefoot. But that commander made it back to British lines. In fact, almost everyone did, and all the vehicles that had been destroyed were repaired or replaced within 24 hours. Wittmann lost 6 Tigers at a time when there was only 36 operational across the entire front line, in an attack that ultimately achieved nothing that would have gone better had he just sat on his hands. But it makes an excellent story. And that's all this really is. A story. A work of German propaganda that changed an embarrassing failure into a legend of cunning and wit, and proof that the Tiger was mighty and the Allied tanks weak. A tale retold by wehraboo's again and again and again, with very little fact-checking ever taking place, unless it's to quickly read a book or a blog of another wehraboo to confirm that everything you believe is correct. It's another example, perhaps the greatest example, of a story where the factual accuracy has been lost to the convenience of the narrative, and where seemingly qualified historians have continued to propagate the work of Nazi propagandists because they think it sounds cool. It is the single greatest myth of the war ever made, and its champion was a pandered propaganda star who was average at best, whose single action when he was finally left to his own devices and didn't have anyone else holding his hand was to lose decisively at the cost of his entire unit. A huge amount of irreplaceable equipment. Wittmann was not a heroic tactical genius. He was not the greatest tank commander who ever lived, nor was he just an honourable man doing his duty. He was an arrogant, self-centred twat who shot at ambulances and fleeing tank crews, and who ordered his entire unit to remain behind while he charged blindly ahead, desperate to hoard all the glory for himself. It was luck, not skill, that got him that far into Villers-Bocage. Had Sabera not noticed and taken out that Firefly, it would have shot Wittmann in the back the second he blasted through that hedge. Had Dias had his gunner on board, he would have gotten a rare perfect shot directly into Wittmann's rear as he thundered past him. Had Paddy Victory been facing the right way, or had his turret not jammed, had Lockwood's gun sights been configured correctly, the story of Michael Wittmann would have ended as a footnote in history told to young tank commanders about the perils of driving off alone without support. Because of his actions, the Germans in that region were now under strength. They'd lost the element of surprise, and Wittmann became the first Tiger tank casualty on the Western Front. While the wehraboo's proudly proclaim he stopped a major Allied advance in its tracks, the Brits would retake Villers-Bocage the following month, and Caen itself shortly after. Wittmann's heroism, bravery, and masterful skill shown that day landed him a desk job far from the actual fighting. When he threw a temper tantrum, argued, bribed, and eventually threatened to go public about being shelved, he was given command of another Tiger group to command, of which he immediately attacked the British and Canadians head-on, on a clear day, over open ground, and was immediately killed. And that is the true legacy of Michael Wittmann, and in its own way the true legacy of fascism and the type of men it produces. They may look good from a distance, they may even act in a way that compels this idea of professionalism and gentlemanly conduct, they may even inspire the concept of greatness, but rather like those people who label themselves as alpha males and argue on the internet, when shit hits the fan and when it comes their time to shine and prove they are who they present to be, they're about as useful as the traffic lights in Grand Theft Auto. Actually, before we end, I have just one little thing to add. You see, there's this part of the battle that often goes ignored, outside of the stuff that I've just covered, of course. Some people who are more familiar with this battle may know that just before Wittmann hit those Cromwells, where Dias and the others were sitting around, there's these two Stuarts in the way. Now, some people think there's three Stuarts, that's because there's this third one that shows up later. It's a common mistake, don't worry about it. But these Stuarts, these are very, very light tanks, very lightly armed. They've got 37mm cannons. The Brits have had these things since the desert. They bought them from America. America uses them as well. They're pretty decent little recon tanks, but not really something you want to be in when, say for example, a Tiger is driving down the road towards you. So the first Stuart makes the very sensible decision. They bail immediately. They just dive for cover. They're not taking any chances. But the other Stuart does not. This one is commanded by one Rex Ingram. He saw this Tiger hurtling down the street towards him, and rather than run, rather than bail, he took the damn thing head on. He fires machine guns at the driver's port, he fires smoke, he fires his main gun, all attempting to button this Tiger down, to blind it. He starts driving aggressively to try and slew it off the road, his massive titanium balls causing the tank to rock from side to side. It doesn't work. Wittmann puts a shot through the Stuart, and Rex and all his crew are unfortunately killed instantly. But it gave time for the others to realise what is happening, and many who were outside their tanks at the time, including the crew of a nearby scout car, dive for cover. The sound of Rex's tank exploding is what made Dias reverse into the garden long before he saw Wittmann. It made Paddy Victory try to get his tank to turn around. It gave Lockwood cause to realise that something was up, and allegedly made him duck back into the turret and load up an AP shell. Rex gave everyone just that little bit extra time. Had he not done what he had done, the death toll might have been just that little bit higher. And for years, his bravery has never really been fully recognised. His actions have been utterly overshadowed by this pathetic hero worship of his killer. He occupies the footnote that, honestly, Wittmann should be in. So if you're like me, and you have a drink in your hand, to Rex, cheers.